In the history of American intelligence and law enforcement agencies, there have been numerous cases where their employees were convicted of serious crimes, such as espionage, corruption, and the unauthorized disclosure of classified information. These cases not only shocked the public, but also raised critical questions about security, transparency, and oversight within agencies like the FBI, CIA, Pentagon, and State Department. Here are 10 notable cases that became part of the history of American intelligence agencies. Kendall Myers had always been seen as a model public servant. Working in the U.S. State Department for decades, his life appeared to be one of dedication, routine, and quiet service to his country. To those around him, he was a man of principle, a man who worked diligently to uphold the values of the United States. However, beneath the surface of his respectable career, Myers harbored a deep political belief that, eventually, overshadowed his loyalty to his country. Over time, he grew disillusioned with the American government, and what began as small, seemingly insignificant exchanges of information slowly evolved into a full-blown betrayal. For nearly 30 years, Myers secretly passed critical national secrets to Cuban intelligence. He justified his actions by convincing himself that he was serving a higher cause, one that aligned with his political views rather than the interests of the nation that had employed him. At first, it may have seemed like minor acts of defiance, giving away bits of information here and there, perhaps as an expression of discontent with his government, but over time, his actions became more deliberate and systematic. He began to provide sensitive intelligence about U.S. operations, confidential communications, and details about diplomatic efforts, all the while convinced that Cuba, with its defiance against U.S. foreign policy, was the rightful recipient of these secrets. While Kendall Myers continued to live a life that seemed normal on the surface, the truth was that he had transformed into a covert operative working for an adversarial government. To his family, friends, and colleagues, he was simply a dedicated, if somewhat quiet, career diplomat. But behind closed doors, he was passing off information that could have catastrophic implications for U.S. security. His actions weren't motivated by ideology as much as a deep sense of political frustration, a belief that his contributions to Cuba would somehow correct what he perceived as a flawed U.S. policy. It is possible that over time, Myers grew numb to the true consequences of his actions, no longer considering the lives that could be lost, the national security compromised, or the trust he was betraying. The investigation into Myers' activities was neither swift nor easy. At first, it was a slow build with nothing more than whispers and suspicions. There were inconsistencies in his behavior, his sudden unexplained wealth, and unusual connections to foreign nationals, signals that something wasn't right. But Myers continued to cover his tracks, moving carefully, quietly, just like any seasoned spy would. It wasn't until the FBI started piecing together the small signs that the investigation gained momentum. Over time, the net tightened around him, and the life he had so carefully built, his facade as a loyal government worker, began to crack. His growing paranoia must have been palpable as the investigation zeroed in on him. His trust in his ability to evade discovery began to wane, and by 2009, the truth could no longer be hidden. When Kendall Myers was finally arrested, the full extent of his espionage was revealed. The damage was deep, reaching not just the immediate victims of the secrets he had passed on, but also the broader framework of U.S. foreign policy and national security. During his trial, Myers defended his actions, convinced that his long-standing allegiance to Cuba somehow made him justified in betraying the United States. Yet, as the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that there was no excuse for what he had done. The weight of his betrayal against the trust of his government, his colleagues, and the American people was undeniable. His espionage had undermined the very foundation of national security, and the consequences were far-reaching. In the end, Kendall Myers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were final, irrevocable, and they sealed his fate. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing the sentence read, did Myers fully understand the enormity of his actions? Was the cause he had once believed in worth the cost of everything he had lost? His life, once dedicated to public service, was now defined by a single act of betrayal that would follow him for the rest of his days. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all gone. Myers had traded his future for a cause that, in the end, offered him nothing but regret. He would never again walk free, and the legacy of his actions would remain a dark chapter in the history of U.S. espionage. Aldrich Ames had always appeared to be the epitome of loyalty and professionalism. A senior CIA officer, Ames was entrusted with some of the most sensitive information the U.S. government held. To his colleagues, he was a quiet, dedicated man, someone who had the nation's best interests at heart. Ames had built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the highest levels of secrecy. Yet beneath this facade of integrity, he was living a double life, one that would ultimately lead to the destruction of countless CIA operations and the loss of numerous agents' lives. For years, Ames had been secretly feeding the Soviet Union and later Russia critical intelligence in exchange for money. His betrayal did not happen in a moment of rash decision-making. It was calculated and methodical. Ames had not been lured into espionage by a sudden ideology or an impromptu decision. It was a slow burn. Perhaps Ames felt overlooked by the CIA, passed over for promotions, or perhaps he was simply driven by a sense of personal frustration and greed. Whatever his motivations, his actions would become one of the most devastating espionage operations in U.S. history. For more than a decade, he was able to fly under the radar, expertly concealing his duplicity. The investigation into Ames's activities began slowly, fueled by vague suspicions rather than concrete evidence. For a long time, Ames maintained his calm and professional demeanor. His seemingly modest lifestyle and unremarkable behavior kept him out of suspicion. Yet, as the CIA began to realize that someone within their ranks was leaking information, the pieces started to fall into place. The investigators began to dig deeper, connecting various incidents and minor irregularities until the full extent of Ames' betrayal began to emerge. The more they uncovered, the more horrific the revelations became. It wasn't just a case of a man passing secrets to a foreign power. It was a betrayal that had led to the exposure of agents, the disbanding of operations, and the tragic execution of U.S. As the investigation progressed, the scope of Ames's espionage became clearer, and it was chilling to think about how many lives had been lost because of him. His actions had compromised the safety of many CIA agents working undercover. The agents he had exposed had been executed, and entire intelligence operations had been undone. The toll of his actions was not only measured in the money he had received, but in the lives that had been irrevocably altered or lost. Ames's trial was an agonizing spectacle, a sobering reminder of how betrayal can unfold in the most unexpected places. The evidence against him was undeniable. His actions had caused incalculable damage to U.S. intelligence operations, and the ripple effects were felt for years. There was no escaping the truth, and Ames could not deny the weight of the evidence. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison, a fitting but tragic end for a man who had once served his country. As he was led away in shackles, there must have been moments of regret, perhaps even remorse, as the full realization of his actions sank in. But did he truly feel the weight of his betrayal? Was he overwhelmed by guilt? Or did he still hold on to the justification that led him down this dark path? Ames had destroyed his career, his family, and his life. The greed and sense of entitlement that had driven him to betray his country had cost him everything. His name would forever be linked to one of the most catastrophic espionage cases in American history, and his legacy would always be defined by the lives he destroyed in pursuit of money and personal gain. Lawrence Franklin had long been a dedicated employee at the Pentagon, a man who prided himself on his service to his country. He believed in the integrity of the system and had always trusted that his work contributed to the national interest. For years, Franklin had been involved in policy discussions regarding the Middle East, particularly concerning U.S. relations with Iran. His position placed him at the heart of U.S. foreign policy, where sensitive information flowed through his hands. However, over time, as tensions with Iran escalated, Franklin's faith in the system began to falter. He became disillusioned with the direction his country was taking, particularly its policies toward Iran, and started questioning the moral justification of those policies. Eventually, Franklin's doubts turned into action. He decided to pass on sensitive U.S. government documents to Israeli officials, documents that detailed strategic plans and policies towards Iran. It was not an impulsive act of betrayal, but a carefully considered decision, born from Franklin's belief that Israel, a key U.S. ally, should have access to this critical information to protect itself from a perceived threat. Franklin didn't view himself as a traitor. In his mind, he was performing a patriotic duty to help a close ally navigate a dangerous geopolitical situation. To him, the release of these documents was a service to the greater good, and he justified his actions as helping Israel and promoting peace in a volatile region. But the consequences of his decision would unfold with devastating clarity as the investigation into his actions began. Franklin's breach of security was not immediately discovered, but as time passed, his unauthorized disclosures were noticed by the authorities. What Franklin thought was a noble act to aid an ally quickly became something far more dangerous. The documents he had passed contained highly classified information, and his actions compromised not only U.S. national security, but also the delicate balance of international relations. The impact of his betrayal would be far-reaching, as it not only affected the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also threatened the integrity of U.S. intelligence efforts. The investigation into Franklin's actions was thorough and methodical. The FBI began to piece together the evidence linking him to the leaks, uncovering his secret communications with Israeli officials. As the investigation progressed, it became undeniable that Franklin had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Despite his defense, which emphasized his years of service and his belief that he was acting in the best interest of his country, the evidence weighed heavily against him. His justification for passing the information fell apart under scrutiny, as it became clear that he had violated his oath and the trust placed in him by his country. Franklin's trial was a sobering affair, as the weight of his actions became fully apparent. The court found him guilty of providing classified information to a foreign government, and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. However, the sentence was later reduced to just 10 months of house arrest, a decision that sparked public outrage. Many felt that such a lenient punishment was insufficient for the gravity of his crime. The reduction in his sentence seemed almost like an injustice in itself, considering the severity of the breach. As Franklin sat at home, under house arrest, his career in ruins, he must have realized that no matter how he had justified his actions, the consequences were permanent. His career, his reputation, and his future were all irreparably damaged by his decision. The trust he had lost, both in himself and in the eyes of those who had once relied on him, could never be restored. His legacy, once shaped by years of service to his country, would now be forever tainted by this one moment of betrayal. Jonathan Booma had always believed in the power of truth. Throughout his career as an FBI agent, he prided himself on his dedication to upholding justice, always seeking what was right. But over time, his view of the system began to shift. He grew disillusioned with what he perceived as political bias within the FBI. An organization that he had once thought of as infallible. The sense of frustration built within him, and he started to question whether the institution he worked for truly served the public good. The lines between right and wrong blurred in his mind, and soon, the sense of duty that once guided him began to fade. As the years passed, Booma's disillusionment reached a breaking point. Feeling that the FBI was not functioning as it should, he made the fateful decision to leak over 130 confidential FBI documents. In his mind, he was not committing a crime, but rather fulfilling a moral duty. He believed that the American public had a right to know what was happening behind the scenes, especially regarding what he saw as corrupt or biased practices within the agency. To him, revealing the truth was more important than protecting the integrity of the FBI. The documents he leaked detailed sensitive operations and internal communications, which had the potential to compromise national security. But Booma didn't see this as a consequence. He saw it as a necessary evil for the greater good. The leaks did not go unnoticed. What seemed like a righteous act of transparency quickly turned into a crisis. The investigation into Booma's actions was thorough and relentless. The FBI, realizing that their own agent was the source of the leaks, launched a full-scale investigation. Tracing the documents back to Booma was not an easy task, but the authorities worked meticulously to uncover the truth. As the investigation tightened around him, Booma must have felt the weight of his actions. Did he second-guess himself? Was there a moment when he realized the true cost of his decisions? Perhaps, but by then the damage had already been done. The documents he had released exposed highly sensitive information, putting not only national security at risk but also the lives of individuals working in covert operations. As the noose tightened around him, Booma had to confront the reality that his belief in revealing the truth had come at a high price. When the trial began, Booma's defense team tried to portray him as a whistleblower, a man acting out of conscience rather than malicious intent. They argued that his actions were driven by a sense of duty to the public, believing that exposing the truth was more important than adhering to the strict rules of confidentiality. But the prosecution painted a much darker picture. They argued that Booma's actions were reckless, that his personal frustration with the FBI had led him to jeopardize national security. The evidence against him was clear, and the court could not overlook the magnitude of his betrayal. Despite his justification, Booma had put his personal beliefs above the safety and security of the nation, an unforgivable breach of trust. The jury found him guilty of leaking confidential documents, and the consequences of his actions were set in stone. Booma faced a harsh reality. His belief in doing what he thought was right had ultimately led to his downfall. The legal system, while perhaps sympathetic to his frustration, could not ignore the gravity of his crime. The damage had been done, and Booma now had to live with the consequences. His life, once dedicated to serving his country, was now marked by his betrayal. As the verdict was read, he must have known that the price of his actions was far higher than he could have ever anticipated. His career, his future, and his reputation were all irreparably damaged. And in that moment, the truth he had sought to expose seemed almost irrelevant, swallowed by the irreversible consequences of his decision. Earl Edwin Pitts had once been a trusted FBI agent serving his country with what seemed like unwavering dedication. To his colleagues and superiors, he was the ideal agent, focused, disciplined, and committed to protecting national security. However, behind the facade of loyalty, Pitts was living a double life, one that would eventually unravel and reveal a shocking betrayal. From 1987 to 1992, Pitts sold critical U.S. secrets to the Soviet Union, betraying everything he had sworn to protect. His actions threatened to compromise national security on a scale that few could have anticipated, putting lives at risk and jeopardizing sensitive operations that had been years in the making. Unlike many spies, Pitts wasn't motivated by political ideology or a deep-seated belief in the cause he was aiding. Instead, his betrayal was driven by personal gain. Greed consumed him, blinding him to the catastrophic consequences of his actions. Pitts may have told himself that he was simply trying to provide a better life for his family, but in reality, he was sacrificing the very foundation of his integrity for financial security. In his mind, perhaps the immediate rewards were worth it, but he failed to consider the far-reaching consequences of his choices. His espionage didn't just cost him his career, it threatened to destroy the trust that had been placed in him by the very agency he had worked for. The investigation into Pitt's activities was slow and methodical. At first, there were only minor signs: his lavish spending, unexplained wealth, and sudden changes in lifestyle. These raised suspicions among his colleagues and eventually led to a deeper investigation. The FBI worked tirelessly to connect the dots, following the trail of money and tracing back to the covert dealings that had marked Pitt's downfall. As the evidence began to mount, it became increasingly clear that Pitts had betrayed his country in exchange for a few moments of financial luxury. The documents he had passed on contained sensitive intelligence, and the lives of those working undercover for the U.S. were now at risk because of him. When the investigation finally reached its conclusion, Pitts could no longer deny the magnitude of his crimes. In court, the evidence presented against him was irrefutable, and he had no choice but to admit his actions. His once pristine reputation as a dedicated FBI agent was now tarnished beyond repair. Pitts was sentenced to 27 years in prison for his espionage, though he was released in 2019 after serving part of his sentence. But as he sat in his prison cell, one has to wonder if the weight of his betrayal ever truly sank in. Was the momentary financial security worth the countless lives he had endangered? In the end, the punishment for his crime would never truly match the scale of the damage he had caused, a legacy of betrayal that would follow him for the rest of his life. Brian P. Regan had always been the type of person who followed the rules. A dedicated Pentagon employee, he had access to some of the most sensitive national security documents in the country. For years, he performed his duties with what seemed like unwavering professionalism, earning the trust of his colleagues and superiors. However, as time went on, personal struggles began to weigh heavily on him. Financial difficulties, family pressures, and a growing sense of helplessness clouded his judgment. Regan, overwhelmed by his circumstances, began to see espionage as a potential solution to his problems. In a moment of desperation, Regan made the fateful decision to betray his country. He attempted to pass classified military documents to the Chinese government, believing that by doing so he could secure a better future for himself and his family. His motivations weren't born from a deep ideological belief or a desire to harm his country. Rather, they were driven by the desire to alleviate his personal struggles. But espionage, no matter the personal reasons behind it, is a serious crime, a breach of trust that can have devastating consequences. Regan's plan was interrupted before it could do any lasting damage. The FBI, already vigilant and aware of potential leaks, quickly noticed irregularities in his behavior. Investigators traced his movements and communication patterns, slowly piecing together the details of his betrayal. The investigation into Regan's actions was swift and thorough, leaving him with little room to evade the inevitable. He must have felt the weight of his actions as the net closed in on him. What had started as a misguided attempt to solve his problems had now become an act of treason that could jeopardize national security and the safety of countless individuals. When Regan was arrested, the full scope of his crime began to unfold. The severity of his actions was undeniable, and the consequences of his betrayal were far-reaching. He had attempted to sell secrets that could compromise U.S. military operations and put lives at risk. In the courtroom, Regan's defense centered around the argument that he had acted out of desperation, driven by personal issues rather than malice. But the evidence was overwhelming. His actions had endangered the very security of the nation, and there was no excusing that. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. As Regan sat in his cell, far from the ordinary life he had once known, the full realization of his crime must have begun to sink in. His attempt to fix his problems had only compounded them, leading him to a life defined by regret and imprisonment. In the quiet solitude of his confinement, did he finally recognize the irreversible consequences of his choices? Would he ever reconcile the man he had been with the actions that led to his downfall? His life, once full of potential and promise, was now marked by the irreversible decision to betray the trust of his country. Robert Philip Hansen was the embodiment of loyalty and service. A devout Catholic, a dedicated family man, and a respected FBI agent, he had built a reputation for being a model employee. His career seemed unblemished, marked by a commitment to safeguarding the security of his country. To everyone who knew him, Hansen was the ideal agent. Dedicated, professional, and trustworthy. However, behind this outward persona was a man who harbored a deep secret, one that would lead to one of the most infamous cases of espionage in U.S. history. For over 2 decades, from 1979 until his arrest in 2001, Hansen betrayed his country by working as a spy for the Soviet Union and later for Russia. While his colleagues believed him to be a loyal servant of the state, Hansen was secretly passing classified U.S. intelligence to the Soviets. This included highly sensitive information about U.S. operations and the identities of double agents, some of whom were executed as a result of Hansen's leaks. His actions were catastrophic, endangering not only the safety of intelligence agents, but also the effectiveness of critical national security efforts. Unlike many spies, Hansen's motivations were not driven by ideological zeal or a desire for revenge. Instead, they were rooted in personal dissatisfaction. He felt overlooked for promotions and underappreciated by the FBI. These feelings of frustration festered over time, leading him to justify his betrayal. In exchange for large sums of money, Hansen provided the Soviets with valuable intelligence, which not only compromised U.S. national security, but also led to the death of American agents and the collapse of intelligence operations that had taken years to establish. The investigation into Hansen's espionage activities was long and arduous. The FBI had long suspected that there was a mole within their ranks, but Hansen was so meticulous in covering his tracks that the truth remained elusive for years. The trail of suspicion led to many dead ends, and for a time, it seemed as though the mole would never be found. However, in 2000, a Russian informant provided crucial information that linked Hansen to the leaks. The truth finally began to unfold, and as the investigation closed in on Hansen, he must have realized that the end was near. Did he question his actions, or did he continue to justify his betrayal to the very end? During his trial, Hansen's defense tried to argue that he had acted out of frustration with his career and disillusionment with the FBI. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and it was clear that his actions had jeopardized national security and caused irreparable damage. Hansen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions must have been impossible to ignore. His career, once marked by years of dedicated service, was now irrevocably tainted by his betrayal. The legacy he had worked so hard to build was overshadowed by the devastating consequences of his actions. Mark Rossini had always been someone who knew the right people. As an FBI agent, he was positioned within an organization that granted him access to sensitive and highly classified information. However, instead of using this privileged position to uphold justice, Rossini exploited it for personal and political gain. From 1991 to 2008, he used his access to FBI databases not for the benefit of the country, but to serve his own interests and the political agendas of others. He leaked confidential information to a political consultant, providing them with the tools to manipulate the political process in Puerto Rico. What began as small, seemingly inconsequential favors, passing along information here and there, soon escalated into a full-blown betrayal. At first, Rossini might have justified these actions as harmless, simply helping out someone in need of information. But as time passed, the stakes grew higher, and his actions became more deliberate. He crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Each document he leaked carried consequences, and with each passing day, he buried himself deeper in a web of deceit. Did Rossini recognize the damage he was causing? Could he see how his actions were undermining not just his career, but the very integrity of the FBI and the democratic system he had sworn to protect? The investigation into Rossini's activities was thorough and slow, methodical in its pursuit of the truth. The FBI began to notice discrepancies in several cases he had worked on and soon realized there was a pattern. Rossini's personal political interests were entwined with the confidential information he had accessed. The investigation grew more intense, and as the net began to tighten around him, Rossini must have felt the pressure mounting. He had to understand that his career, his reputation, and his freedom were all at risk. Yet, no matter how carefully he had tried to cover his tracks, the evidence was undeniable, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The web he had woven was unraveling, and the magnitude of his betrayal was becoming clear. In court, Rossini's defense team argued that his actions were not criminal, but part of a broader political strategy. However, the prosecution laid out a compelling case that revealed the true nature of his actions. Rossini had used his position within the FBI, not for the benefit of national security, but to manipulate the political process for personal and political gain. His breach of trust had not only compromised the integrity of the FBI, but had also posed a threat to the democratic process itself. In the end, Rossini was convicted, and the sentence served as a stark reminder of the dangers of corruption within law enforcement. As he listened to his sentence in the courtroom, did he feel the weight of what he had done? The political maneuvering that had once seemed so thrilling had now led him to this moment. His career destroyed, his reputation shattered, and his future uncertain. The consequences of his actions were far greater than he had ever anticipated. Robert G. Lustig Jr. had long been a trusted figure within the FBI. Known for his ability to oversee some of the most sensitive investigations, he had built a career based on trust and responsibility. However, in 2011 and 2012, Lustig's career took a drastic turn as he became entangled in a series of corruption schemes that ultimately unraveled everything he had worked for. Using his position within the FBI, Lustig obstructed an investigation into a defense contractor by accepting bribes in exchange for protecting the company from legal scrutiny. This was just the beginning. Lustig's greed didn't stop there. He also engaged in a separate bribery plot involving a Bangladeshi national, trading confidential FBI documents for financial gain. Initially, Lustig's actions seemed like small, justifiable compromises. Perhaps he believed he was protecting national interests or securing a desired outcome. But as time went on, these small compromises grew into something far more dangerous. Lustig crossed the line, becoming not just an enforcer of justice, but an active participant in the very corruption he was supposed to fight against. His betrayal of the values he had sworn to uphold became more pronounced, but it wasn't until later that the full extent of his actions came to light. Lustig's involvement in bribery was no longer an isolated incident. It was a pattern of misconduct that damaged the integrity of the FBI and compromised the safety of the nation. The investigation into Lustig was complex, involving multiple agencies and an extensive review of his activities. The evidence against him mounted steadily, and soon it became clear that he had used his powerful position not for the benefit of the public, but for personal gain. The more the investigators uncovered, the more his reputation within the FBI crumbled. His years of loyal service to the agency were overshadowed by his calculated betrayal. As the investigation progressed, Lustig must have known that there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. His actions had undermined not only the agency's integrity, but also the public's trust in the justice system. At trial, Lustig's defense tried to portray him as a man caught in a difficult situation, someone who had made mistakes but did so out of a sense of necessity. They argued that he had been under pressure and had acted in a way that seemed justifiable at the time. However, the prosecution painted a far darker picture. They argued that Lustig had knowingly and willfully participated in illegal schemes, betraying his oath to protect and serve the American people. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Lustig was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As the gavel struck and the sentence was handed down, Lustig had no choice but to face the reality of his actions. In those final moments, as his fate was sealed, did he feel the weight of his betrayal? Was there regret for the career he had destroyed? Or did he still believe that the rewards of his actions had been worth the risks? Robert F. Cherio had built a reputation as a trusted and reliable FBI agent. He was given the responsibility of overseeing crucial evidence in a major corruption case, a position that required integrity, attention to detail, and a deep sense of duty to the law. His career had been defined by his adherence to the principles of justice, and he had earned the respect of his colleagues. However, one fateful day, Cherio made a decision that would not only destroy his career, but also undermine the very justice system he had once vowed to protect. In a moment of personal weakness, Cherio chose to destroy critical evidence that could have led to the conviction of powerful individuals involved in a high-profile corruption case. His justification for this act of destruction seemed simple and personal. He claimed that he was merely protecting private information, perhaps believing that his actions were justified by a sense of privacy or personal responsibility. But in reality, he was sabotaging the investigation, ensuring that those who had been implicated in corruption would avoid the legal consequences of their actions. The destruction of this evidence wasn't just a minor mistake. It was a deliberate and calculated act of betrayal against the public trust and the integrity of the FBI. As the investigation into the destruction of evidence unfolded, the pressure on Cherio must have grown overwhelming. His actions had disrupted not only the investigation at hand, but also the broader efforts of the FBI to maintain its credibility and uphold justice. The scope of his betrayal began to emerge, and the realization of the damage he had caused must have weighed heavily on him. How could he explain what he had done? Was he truly capable of justifying his actions? Or had he become so entangled in his own justifications that he failed to see the larger consequences? What began as one seemingly harmless decision to destroy evidence soon snowballed into a full-blown crisis, both for the investigation and for Cherrio himself. When Cherrio faced trial, his defense team attempted to frame his actions as unintentional, suggesting that his decision to destroy the evidence had been born out of concern for personal privacy. However, the prosecution painted a much darker picture. They argued that Cherrio had intentionally sabotaged the course of justice, undermining the very foundation of the evidence against him was clear, and there was no escaping the fact that he had acted out of personal interest rather than a commitment to the truth. The case was not just about the destruction of evidence, it was about the betrayal of an agent's oath to uphold the law. In the end, Cherrio was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. As he listened to the judge's verdict, the weight of his actions must have finally sunk in. The decision he had made in a moment of weakness had permanently altered the trajectory of his life. His legacy, which had once been built on years of service and dedication, was now overshadowed by a single catastrophic act of betrayal. His career was destroyed, his reputation irreparably tarnished, and his freedom taken away. In those final moments, as the gavel fell, did Cherrio realize that the consequences of his actions were far greater than he had ever anticipated? The single act of destroying evidence had not only cost him his career, but had also become the defining chapter of his life. These 10 cases illustrate the depth of the problem of corruption and espionage within American intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Each of these criminals caused significant consequences for national security and public trust in government institutions. These cases serve as a reminder of the critical need for strict oversight and accountability in such agencies to prevent the leaking of information and the destruction of their reputations.